The courtroom doors slam open and the air thickens with the weight of what is about to unfold. Detective John Hayes and Officer Maria Lopez step into the room, their eyes scanning the space as they walk toward their seats. The murmur of the crowd quiets as all attention turns toward them. Hayes, tall with a hardened face, and Lopez standing beside him, her posture straight, her expression focused. Both of them exude an air of quiet intensity as they sit down, their eyes never leaving the man sitting at the defendant's table, Captain Edward Hall, the head of internal affairs. The man who once held their careers in his hands now stands accused of being the very thing he swore to destroy: corruption within the police force. For years, Hall had been the one to root out the bad apples. He had been the symbol of justice for the department, but now it was his own actions that had come under scrutiny. Hall had spent years covering up the crimes of his colleagues, shielding corrupt officers from accountability, manipulating investigations to protect his friends and allies in the force, and Hayes and Lopez had spent months gathering evidence to expose him. They had been his loyal soldiers, but when they realized the truth, when they uncovered the depths of his corruption, they knew they had no choice but to take him down. They knew that bringing down Hall was bigger than any one of them. It was about restoring the integrity of the force. It was about justice for the victims who had been denied it for too long. And now they were here in this courtroom facing the very man who had betrayed everything they had believed in. As the two officers settle into their seats, the air in the room grows heavier. The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, rises from her seat. She is a sharp and determined attorney, known for her ability to dismantle even the most difficult cases. Today, she is about to take on the challenge of her career. She faces the jury and begins her opening statement. She tells them that they will hear the truth today, a truth that will shake the foundations of the police department. She speaks about the bravery of Hayes and Lopez, how they risked everything to uncover the corruption that Hall had hidden for so long. She describes how these two officers had once trusted Hall, how they had believed in the system he represented, but when they discovered the ugly reality of what was happening behind closed doors, they chose to expose it for the greater good. The prosecution then calls Detective Hayes to the stand. Hayes stands tall and walks toward the witness box, his hands steady. Despite the tension, he has seen his fair share of danger, but nothing compares to the weight of what he is about to do. As he sits down and faces the jury, he takes a deep breath and begins his testimony. He speaks about the first time he noticed something was wrong, how Hall had handled a case that didn't sit right with him, how the investigation had been abruptly closed with little explanation. The more Hayes had dug, the more he found inconsistencies, the more he had realized that Hall was not the man he had once respected. The more he uncovered, the more he knew that the corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The room listens in silence. Hayes' words, like a slow-moving storm building toward a climax, as he describes the series of events that led him to believe that Hall was not just a bystander in the corruption, but an active participant in its orchestration. Captain Hall sits at the defendant's table, his hands folded calmly in front of him, his eyes scanning the room, his face betraying no emotion. He knows the stakes, but he's confident he has the upper hand. He has always been in control of the department. His position as the head of internal affairs has given him power, influence, and the respect of his peers. But today he is not the one holding the cards. Today, he is the one being scrutinized. As Hayes continues his testimony, Hall shifts in his seat, his jaw tightens, but he makes no move to interrupt. He knows his time will come soon enough. The prosecution turns its attention to Officer Lopez and calls her to the stand. She rises and walks toward the witness box. Her steps measured, her expression focused as she takes her place. She knows how difficult this is about to be, how her words will carry weight that will either shatter or strengthen everything they have worked for. As she faces the jury, her gaze unwavering, she begins her testimony with a quiet but firm voice. She speaks of her partnership with Hayes, how they had always followed the rules, how they had trusted the system. But that trust had been tested when they started to uncover the truth about Hall and the corruption he had hidden from everyone. She recalls the countless late nights spent poring over files, digging through reports, and conducting their own investigation. They had seen things that didn't add up. They had seen things that no one wanted to acknowledge. As she speaks, her words are clear and deliberate, every sentence carefully crafted to paint a picture of betrayal and deceit. She talks about the first time they began to suspect Hall's involvement in covering up the wrongdoings of other officers. She describes how they had stumbled upon evidence suggesting that Hall had been using his position to protect his colleagues from internal investigations, how he had used his power to obstruct justice and shield those who should have been held accountable. Lopez's voice doesn't falter. She continues with the story of how they had decided to take matters into their own hands. They couldn't sit back and allow the corruption to spread any further. They couldn't continue to be part of a system that allowed their colleagues to break the law without facing the consequences. They had to act for their own integrity and for the good of the department. And so they began to gather evidence, secretly recording conversations and tracking Hall's movements. They had to be careful. They knew that if they were caught, they would lose everything, but they also knew that the truth had to come out no matter the cost. As she speaks, Lopez glances over at Hall, his eyes cold and calculating, his face a mask of indifference. But she knows the truth is out now. There's no turning back. The prosecutor steps forward and asks Lopez about the moment when everything changed, when they realized they couldn't ignore the reality of Hall's actions any longer. Lopez hesitates for a moment, then recounts a pivotal moment when she overheard a conversation between Hall and a fellow officer. It was then she realized the full extent of his corruption. It was then that she understood the man she had once trusted had betrayed everything they had worked for, everything they had believed in. As Lopez finishes her testimony, the room is filled with an uneasy silence. The jury exchanges looks, their faces filled with disbelief and concern. The weight of the allegations hangs in the air, and as they turn their eyes toward Hall, his confident demeanor begins to crack ever so slightly. The room is silent as Lopez finishes her testimony, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The jury is still processing the magnitude of what they have just heard. Hayes sits in his seat, his eyes locked on Captain Hall, who remains unfazed, but inside Hall can feel the walls closing in on him. He knows the case against him is building and the pressure is mounting. The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, steps forward and addresses the court. She thanks Lopez for her brave testimony, and then she turns her focus to the next phase of their case. She calls her next witness to the stand, a former detective named Alan Moore, once a respected member of the force, but now a man who has left it all behind. His resignation came after a close encounter with the corruption that had taken root under Hall's leadership. Moore had been one of the first to recognize the cracks in the system, and he had paid the price for it. Now he walks into the courtroom, his eyes downcast, as if the weight of his actions still haunts him. But there is no denying the importance of his testimony. Moore takes the stand, and once again the room falls into a heavy silence. He clears his throat and begins to speak, his voice steady but filled with the echoes of regret. He describes his time working under Captain Hall, how at first he had admired the man for his commitment to justice. But as time passed, Moore began to see the patterns of behavior that didn't align with the ideals they were supposed to uphold. He talks about the specific case that ultimately led to his resignation, a case that involved the protection of a fellow officer who had been caught in a drug trafficking ring. The evidence had been clear, but Hall had moved quickly to close the investigation. It was then Moore realized that the man who had sworn to root out corruption was the one perpetuating it. Moore's voice grows more intense as he recalls the moment when he confronted Hall about the cover-up. It was a brief exchange, but Moore can still hear Hall's calm voice telling him that sometimes protecting the reputation of the department was more important than following the law. Moore had walked away from the force that day feeling betrayed, but knowing deep down that the right decision had been made. He looks toward the jury, now his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and resolve. He tells them that he didn't want to leave, but the system was broken and Hall was at the heart of it. The defense attorney, Tom Douglas, quickly rises and interrupts Moore's testimony. He begins to discredit Moore, accusing him of leaving the force because of his own failings, not because of any moral dilemma. He accuses Moore of trying to shift blame for his own shortcomings, but Moore stands firm, his testimony unwavering. As the defense attorney tries to shake him, he looks directly at the jury and continues his account, ignoring the attacks against his credibility. Moore describes more of Hall's tactics and how the Internal Affairs Department had been used to protect officers rather than investigate them. He speaks of the countless cases that were swept under the rug and the internal cover-ups that Hall orchestrated with a calculating coldness that left Moore feeling powerless. Moore's testimony is a bombshell, and the jury can feel the weight of the words as they sink in. They look to Hall now, his stoic expression betraying nothing but the slightest hint of discomfort. As he shifts in his seat, his defenses beginning to crack. The prosecutor thanks Moore for his testimony and calls for a short recess, but the atmosphere in the courtroom remains tense as the reality of the corruption continues to unfold. The courtroom is thick with tension as the recess ends and everyone takes their seats. Once again, Hayes and Lopez exchange a glance. Both of them know they've crossed a dangerous line, that there's no turning back now. They have to see this through to the end. They've laid the foundation, but the final pieces of the puzzle still need to be revealed. The prosecution turns back to Hayes, now calling him to the stand. Once more the pressure is palpable, but Hayes remains composed. He's been through tough situations before, but this is different. This is personal. This is the man who had once been his superior, the man he had trusted, the man who had led them all. But now Hayes knows the truth, and nothing will stop him from exposing it. Hayes, looks across the room at Captain Hall, who still sits unmoved, his expression a mask of indifference. But Hayes sees through it. He knows the cracks are starting to show. Hall's facade is beginning to crumble as Hayes takes the stand. The prosecutor begins to ask him about the next phase of their investigation. They ask him to recount how he and Lopez had begun collecting more evidence after Moore's resignation. Hayes talks about the secret recordings they had made, the documents they had found, the phone calls they had traced, all of it pointing to Hall and his involvement in a wider network of corruption. Hayes describes a particularly telling moment when he had intercepted a conversation between Hall and another officer discussing how to sabotage an investigation that could expose several other corrupt officers. It was clear to Hayes that Hall wasn't just covering for a few bad apples, he was orchestrating a much larger operation. He speaks of the risks they took to gather this evidence, how they had to work in secrecy, knowing that if they were discovered, they would lose everything, but it was worth it because they knew the truth had to come out. They couldn't allow Hall to keep pulling the strings from the shadows. Hayes's voice is steady, but there's a fire in his eyes as he speaks. He knows this is his moment to make sure that Hall never manipulates the system again. He finishes his testimony and the prosecutor thanks him before turning to Lopez. Once more, Lopez is called back to the stand, and she takes her place with determination. She begins to speak about the final piece of evidence they had uncovered, a set of encrypted files they had managed to decrypt with the help of a former hacker who owed them a favor. Lopez describes how they had discovered a list of officers who had been involved in a series of illegal activities from drug trafficking to money laundering. The files even contained payments that had been made to Hall in exchange for his silence and protection. The defense attorney Tom Douglas tries to interrupt, but Lopez holds her ground, her voice unwavering as she explains the contents of the files. The room is stunned as the details unfold. It's clear that Hall was at the center of it all, pulling the strings behind the scenes. He had been the one protecting the officers involved in criminal activity, and he had been the one collecting payments for his silence. The defense tries to argue that these files could have been fabricated, but Lopez is prepared. She presents the chain of custody, proving the authenticity of the files, and the jury listens intently as she details each transaction, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. One by one, the defense begins to lose ground as Lopez's testimony becomes more damning. Hall sits in his chair, his face betraying no emotion, but his clenched fists betray his growing unease. He knows this is the beginning of the end, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. The courtroom is heavy with anticipation as Lopez finishes her testimony and sits down. The jury exchanges looks and whispers as the weight of the evidence begins to sink in. Hayes watches Hall closely. The once confident captain now seems restless, the smallest flicker of doubt crossing his face for the first time since this trial began. Hall's cold and calculating demeanor begins to show cracks. The defense attorney Tom Douglas stands and begins his cross-examination with practiced calm, his voice smooth as he questions Lopez. He tries to poke holes in her story, casting doubt on her motives, accusing her of personal bias against Hall. But Lopez remains unfazed. She answers each question with quiet certainty, her eyes steady. As she faces the defense attorney, she knows the truth is on their side. No matter how much Douglas tries to undermine it, she stays composed. Even as he tries to twist her words, she speaks of the countless officers who had been hurt by Hall's actions, the officers who had been left in the dark while Hall used his position for personal gain. She talks about the victims of the corruption who had no voice, but who now have the chance to see justice served. The defense grows more aggressive as they realize their position is slipping. They try to discredit the decrypted files, accusing Lopez and Hayes of tampering with the evidence, but Lopez stands firm with the same conviction she had shown since the beginning. She presents proof that the files have been accessed and decrypted legally through a secure chain of custody. She lays out every step of the process, proving that the evidence was authentic and it cannot be ignored. Her testimony is airtight, and the defense has nothing left to say. The prosecutor Rachel Kim rises from her seat and calls the next witness to the stand, a former police officer who had worked under Hall for several years. He had left the department after becoming disillusioned with Hall's actions, and now he is ready to speak out. His name is Daniel West, and he takes the stand with visible discomfort. But there is a fire in his eyes, a sense of determination that hadn't been there before. He recounts the time he worked alongside Hall, how at first he had admired the captain's dedication to cleaning up the force, but that admiration faded quickly when he saw the darker side of Hall's leadership. West talks about an incident involving a drug bust where Hall had ordered the destruction of key evidence that could have exposed several officers involved in the operation. It was a small detail at first, But as West dug deeper, he realized that Hall had been orchestrating the cover-up all along. When he tried to confront Hall about the situation, West was threatened and told to stay silent or face severe consequences. It was at that moment that West realized the true extent of Hall's corruption. He had seen it firsthand, but it took all the courage he could muster to walk away from the force. He describes the fear. He felt the pressure to comply with Hall's orders, the weight of knowing that if he spoke out, he could lose everything. West's testimony hits hard. The room falls silent as the jury absorbs the gravity of what he's just revealed. He is the final piece of the puzzle, a man who had seen Hall's manipulation firsthand and lived to tell the tale. The defense tries to counter his testimony, but they fail to discredit him. His words are too powerful, too convincing, and there's nothing they can do to turn the tide. The jury is watching Hall closely now, their eyes narrowing as the truth begins to unfold before them. As Daniel West finishes his testimony, the room remains eerily still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The jury sits frozen, absorbing the full extent of the corruption Hall had orchestrated for so long. West's testimony has been the final blow to Hall's defense. His words had revealed the manipulative tactics Hall had used to silence those who might expose him, and now the case seems all but won. The defense attorney, Tom Douglas, tries to regain his composure and stands with an air of feigned confidence. He turns toward the judge and requests that the case be dismissed on the grounds of insufficient evidence. But the judge raises an eyebrow and quickly denies the motion with a firm voice. The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, rises and calls for the final witness to take the stand, a name that no one had expected to hear. An anonymous tip had led them to this person, a former associate of Hall's, someone who had worked directly with him in a variety of covert operations, someone who had seen the darker side of Hall and was willing to testify against him today. This witness, known only as John Doe, steps forward wearing a heavy disguise, his face obscured and his voice altered through technology to protect his identity. The room grows tense as everyone watches closely. The figure steps into the witness box and begins to speak, his voice deep and distorted. He tells the jury that he had been involved in several high-stakes operations with Hall, many of them shady at best and criminal at worst. He describes how Hall had used his power to make deals with criminals to ensure his own financial gain while betraying the officers who trusted him. He talks about the illegal weapons trades and the money laundering schemes that Hall had been involved in, the deals that had placed money in his pockets at the expense of the very force he had been sworn to protect. The witness goes into graphic detail, recounting how Hall had once arranged for the destruction of evidence to cover up a drug cartel's activities, and how he had sold classified information to the highest bidder, all the while claiming to be the protector of the law. John Doe speaks of how he had been entangled in Hall's schemes for years, only to realize one day that he could no longer ignore the damage being done. He couldn't continue to be a part of something so corrupt, so he made the decision to break free and come forward with the truth. The jury listens intently, every word hitting them with the force of a sledgehammer. The defense attorney rises to object, but the judge swiftly overrules him. The truth is unraveling at an unstoppable pace, and even Hall cannot hide behind his former position any longer. The defense tries to argue that John Doe's testimony is unreliable, but the judge reminds them that it is not the credibility of the witness being questioned, but the veracity of the information that matters. The defense falters, unable to mount an effective challenge. John Doe's testimony has already made its mark, and now it is just a matter of time before the final verdict is delivered. As the witness finishes his testimony, the room is filled with an overwhelming sense of finality. The defense knows they have lost, and Captain Hall knows that his empire is crumbling all around him. He looks across the courtroom, his gaze shifting from the jury to Hayes and Lopez, his expression hardening, but his eyes no longer carry the same confident arrogance that had once defined him. Now, he is just a man trapped by his own lies and deceit. The courtroom is in a stunned silence as John Doe finishes his testimony. The weight of his words reverberates through the room. The jury shifts uncomfortably in their seats as they process the magnitude of what they have just heard. The defense has no more witnesses to call, and the prosecution has laid out their case in a way that leaves no room for doubt. Hall's corruption has been exposed from every angle. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Hall sits in his chair, his hands are now trembling just slightly. The facade of confidence he had carefully maintained throughout the trial has crumbled beneath the weight of the truth. He tries to maintain his composure, but it's clear to everyone that he is no longer in control of the situation. The prosecution rests its case, and the judge turns to the defense, giving them the opportunity to present any final arguments. Douglas stands slowly and walks to the center of the courtroom. He speaks calmly, at first attempting to reassure the jury that the case against Hall is based on circumstantial evidence. He argues that the testimonies presented are tainted by personal vendettas and unsubstantiated claims. He tries to paint Hall as a victim of a witch hunt and insists that there is no direct evidence linking him to the crimes being alleged. His words are smooth and practiced, but the confidence in his voice begins to waver as he realizes the jury is not buying his arguments. The defense continues to press that the prosecution has failed to present a single piece of irrefutable evidence connecting Hall to the alleged crimes, but as he speaks, his words begin to feel hollow. The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, stands and walks to the front of the courtroom, her posture unwavering, her gaze sharp as she addresses the jury. She reminds them of the testimony they have heard, the evidence that has been laid out before them. She speaks of the officers who risked their careers to expose the truth, Hayes and Lopez, who had worked tirelessly to uncover the extent of Hall's corruption. She speaks of Moore and West, who had bravely come forward to testify against him. And she speaks of John Doe, the anonymous witness, whose testimony has confirmed everything they had suspected. She reminds the jury of the encrypted files, the intercepted phone calls, the secret recordings. Everything points to one undeniable truth: Captain Edward Hall had betrayed his badge, his colleagues, and the people he had sworn to protect. Kim's voice rises as she drives the point home that Hall's actions were not the isolated mistakes of a few officers, but a systemic manipulation orchestrated by him from the very top. He had used his position to shield criminals, to profit from his power, and to control the very system that was meant to hold people accountable. Hall had become the very thing he had promised to destroy, the embodiment of corruption within the department. The prosecutor's words are met with silence, but the jury's faces are grim, their expressions unreadable. They know the decision they must make will change everything. The judge looks toward the jury, now instructing them to deliberate on the evidence they have heard. They are to decide Hall's fate with all the facts before them. The tension in the room is palpable as the jury stands and files out of the courtroom. Hayes and Lopez sit quietly, their eyes fixed on the door. Where the jury has exited, they have done everything they can. Now it is out of their hands. All they can do is wait. The room is still as the jury leaves to deliberate, the weight of the trial now resting in their hands. Hayes and Lopez exchange a quiet glance, neither one of them speaking, but both knowing that this moment could change everything. They have been through so much to get here: the long hours, the sleepless nights, the danger they faced in order to uncover the truth. They had fought for justice. And now the final decision rests with 12 strangers who have been watching this case unfold over the past few weeks. The tension in the courtroom is unbearable as they wait for the jury to return. The clock seems to tick louder with every passing second. The defense team sits in a corner, whispering amongst themselves, their faces strained. They know they are losing. They know that no matter how hard they try to discredit the evidence, it is clear that Captain Hall is guilty. But they will fight to the end. They will throw everything they can at the jury to try to create doubt, to cast enough uncertainty that they might find a way to avoid a conviction. But the odds are stacked against them, and they know it. The prosecution team sits across from them, calm and collected, but their eyes are sharp. They are ready for whatever the defense tries to throw at them, because they know they have done their job. They have presented the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and now all they can do is wait. The minutes feel like hours as everyone in the courtroom holds their breath, waiting for the jury's return. When the doors finally open, the courtroom falls into a heavy silence. The jury files in slowly, each member taking their seat, their faces unreadable, their eyes scanning the room as they sit down and wait for the foreman to rise. The judge looks at them, his gaze steady and firm. He nods and gestures for the foreman to speak. The foreman stands and clears his throat. The room is so quiet you could hear a pin drop as the foreman begins to speak the words that will decide Captain Hall's fate. We, the jury, find the defendant, Captain Edward Hall, guilty of all charges. The words hit like a punch to the stomach. Hayes feels his heart race as the foreman's voice rings out. The guilt is undeniable. The man who had once been the leader of the department, the man who had sworn to uphold justice, had betrayed everything he stood for. The courtroom erupts in whispers. Some of the jurors let out sighs of relief, while others remain silent as they process the gravity of the decision. But Hayes and Lopez remain calm, their eyes locked on Hall, who sits in stunned silence, his face pale and devoid of expression. He looks like a man who has lost everything, but there is no pity in their hearts, only the satisfaction of knowing that justice has been served. The defense attorney, Tom Douglas, stands in disbelief, his jaw clenched tight as he gathers his papers in an attempt to regain some semblance of control. But the damage is done. There is no denying the truth. Captain Hall is guilty, and his empire of corruption is finally coming to an end. The judge calls for order in the court, and instructs everyone to remain silent as the sentencing phase of the trial begins. But Hayes and Lopez know that this is only the beginning. They have taken down one of the most powerful men in the department, but the work is far from over. There are still others out there who need to be exposed and held accountable. The fight for justice is not over. The verdict hangs in the air as the courtroom buzzes with reactions. Some of the jurors nod with quiet satisfaction, while others look visibly relieved knowing they've made the right choice. The defense team stands frozen in disbelief, their faces contorted with frustration. But the damage is done. Captain Edward Hall has been found guilty of all charges, and there is no turning back. Hayes and Lopez stand together at the back of the courtroom, their eyes fixed on the man who had once been their leader, now reduced to nothing more than a criminal. The weight of their journey together presses down on them. Both they have fought for this moment, and now that it has come, the emotions are hard to contain. They had risked everything to expose Hall's corruption, their careers, their safety, their personal lives. All of it had been put on the line for this one moment of truth. And now that the verdict has been delivered, they know the fight is far from over. The judge calls for the sentencing hearing to begin, and the room falls silent once again. The defense attorney tries to argue for a lesser sentence, but the judge does not entertain the request. He has heard the evidence, the jury has spoken, and Hall's actions have left no room for leniency. The judge turns to Hall, his voice cold, as he asks if he has anything to say before sentencing. Hall remains silent, his face still frozen in that unreadable expression, but his eyes are filled with something different. Now they are no longer full of arrogance or control, but with a mix of disbelief and fear. The once powerful captain is now a man facing the consequences of his actions. The prosecutor, Rachel Kim, stands and addresses the judge. She speaks of the harm Hall's actions have caused to the department, to the officers who had been forced to work under his shadow, and to the community that had placed its trust in him. She talks about the damage he had done to the very system he was supposed to uphold. She recounts the officers whose lives had been destroyed by Hall's corruption, the families whose loved ones had been hurt or even killed because of his decisions. Hall's actions had undermined the very fabric of justice, and now he must face the consequences. She urges the judge to impose a sentence that reflects the magnitude of his crimes. Lopez watches the exchange silently, her thoughts swirling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she feels vindicated, justice has finally been served, but on the other hand, she feels the weight of the betrayal she experienced, knowing that the very man who had led them all had used his position to exploit and harm the very people he was sworn to protect. The judge listens carefully to the prosecutor's statement, and then turns to the defense attorney, who has no more arguments left to make. His voice is quiet and defeated as he asks for leniency. But it's clear that the case against Hall is far too strong for any such request to be entertained. The judge looks down at the sentencing guidelines before him and finally speaks. Captain Edward Hall, you have been convicted of corruption, abuse of power, and multiple counts of misconduct. Your actions have not only betrayed the people you served, but also the very institution you were entrusted to lead. You have caused immeasurable harm, and for that the sentence must reflect the severity of your crimes. There is no leniency. The room holds its breath as the judge prepares to deliver the final word, and it's clear that Captain Hall's fate has already been sealed. The judge's voice rings out as he delivers the sentence. Captain Edward Hall is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words echo through the courtroom, a final blow to the man who had once held so much power. The room falls into a stunned silence as everyone processes the weight of the decision. Hall's face doesn't change, but there's something about the way he stands there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes narrowed, that tells everyone he is not ready to accept the consequences of his actions. Not yet. The defense attorney gathers his papers and mutters something under his breath, but there's no chance of an appeal. No matter how hard they try, Hall has been convicted, and there's no going back now. The court is dismissed, and the crowd begins to slowly disperse. The once bustling room now feels empty. Hayes and Lopez exchange a brief glance and head toward the door. But even though the trial is over, they know their work is far from finished. The trial was just the beginning. The weight of the corruption they had uncovered still hangs over them like a storm cloud. The department is in chaos. Hall's fall from grace has shaken the very foundation of the force, and they both know that there are more secrets hidden beneath the surface that will need to be exposed. The fight for justice is never truly over. As they step into the hallway, Lopez speaks quietly to Hayes. So what happens now? Hayes thinks for a moment before responding. We rebuild. We take down the rest of them, the officers who helped him, the ones who are still hiding behind their badges. They won't get away with it. Not now. Lopez nods in agreement. We'll clean up the mess Hall left behind. but we'll do it the right way this time. No more shortcuts, no more corruption. They'll answer for everything. Hayes is resolute, his gaze firm. As he walks down the hall, Lopez follows his lead, knowing that this is just the beginning of a long and difficult journey ahead. Despite their success today, the battle against corruption within the department is far from won. There are still more to uncover, more pieces of the puzzle that need to be put together. The real challenge now is to ensure that those who helped Hall remain behind bars, and to root out any remaining corruption before it spreads again. They know it won't be easy, but they've come this far, and they're not backing down. Their victory over Hall feels bittersweet. They know that the damage has been done, and the road to fixing it will be long and painful. They won't rest until every officer involved in Hall's schemes is held accountable. Hayes and Lopez leave the courthouse together, their steps synchronize as they walk out into the cool evening air. The weight of what they've accomplished today still settling in, but with a renewed sense of purpose ahead of them. They may have won this battle, but they know there are still many more to fight. Days pass after the sentencing of Captain Hall, and while the courtroom drama has ended, the real work begins. Hayes and Lopez meet at a small cafe outside the city. They both look weary, but there's a fire in their eyes that tells everyone they're not done yet. They've been following leads, tracking down informants, and piecing together fragments of information. The corruption within the department is deeper than they ever imagined. Hall was just the tip of the iceberg, and they both know it's only a matter of time before they expose more officers who had been complicit in the criminal activities. Hayes leans in across the table, his voice low. We have to be careful about how we move forward. We've already made enemies by taking down Hall. Now we have to make sure we don't step on the wrong toes. Lopez looks at him, nodding slowly, but her expression is resolute. We're not backing down. Not now, she says firmly. We've done too much to let it all slip away. But we need to make sure we have everything before we go public. We can't risk going after people without the evidence. Hayes agrees, but his gaze hardens. We're running out of time. Every day we let them operate unchecked is another day. They get stronger another day. They stay in power. Lopez's phone buzzes on the table. She picks it up, quickly reading the message with a furrowed brow. She looks up at Hayes. We've got something. A source came through. We might have the name of the next officer we need to target, she says. Hayes raises an eyebrow. Who is it? Lopez hesitates for a moment, but then shakes her head. It's someone high up, another captain. He's been under the radar, but it looks like he was involved in the cover-up of some of Hall's more illegal activities. They need to act fast. They can't afford to let this opportunity slip away. Hayes leans back in his chair, thinking for a moment. If we go after him, it won't be easy. He's a high-ranking officer. We need everything in place before we make a move. We don't want him tipping off anyone or disappearing. Lopez nods again. She's already making plans in her mind, but there's a concern that lingers, the danger of pushing too hard too fast. Hayes can see it too, but there's no turning back now. They've gone this far, and they're in too deep to back down now. So what's the plan, she asks. Hayes lets out a slow breath. We take him down carefully. We gather everything we can on him, and then we move quietly. No shavams, no spectacle. We take him down from within the system. He'll never see it coming. Lopez agrees the plan is risky, but it's the only option they have. They've already crossed too many lines and exposed too many secrets to let things go now. They'll have to operate in the shadows, gathering more evidence and building a case that's airtight. No mistakes this time. Lopez reaches for her bag and pulls out a file with more details about the new target. They're ready to dig deeper into this officer's history, uncover any connections he has to the underworld, and start making their move. Hayes watches her prepare for the next phase of their mission, knowing that the road ahead will be even harder than the one they've already traveled, but they've made a promise to themselves and to the officers who had suffered under Hall's reign. They will not stop until every last piece of corruption is rooted out of the department. The days following their meeting with the new lead are filled with tension. Hayes and Lopez work in secret, gathering more information on the officer they intend to take down, but the risks are greater now. The stakes have never been higher. The deeper they dig into the files, the more they realize that they're not just dealing with a single corrupt officer, but a whole network of individuals who have been working together for years to manipulate the system and hide their wrongdoings. They can't expose it all at once. It's too dangerous, too many powerful people involved, and they know the consequences if they make a single misstep. But the pressure is mounting. Every lead they follow brings them closer to a massive corruption scandal, one that could take down more than just a few officers. It could bring the entire department to its knees, and despite the risks, Hayes and Lopez feel the weight of responsibility. They can't let this go. The department needs to be cleaned up, and they're the ones who are going to do it. They spend days reviewing files, making calls, visiting informants, and working around the clock to piece together the full picture. They know that the officer they're targeting has ties to Hall's old network, and that he's been covering up crucial evidence. They also know that he's been involved in illegal activities with outside organizations, but so far nothing concrete has been found. It's all circumstantial. And that's where the danger lies. They need something more than whispers and rumors. They need proof they can take to court. They need to make sure their next move is foolproof. Hayes looks over at Lopez one evening as they sit in her car outside the officer's house. They've been watching him for days, trying to catch him in the act. But so far there's been nothing. Lopez is tired, but her resolve hasn't faltered. She's ready to make her move. Hayes, you ready for this? He asks quietly. She nods firmly. We don't have a choice. We've come too far. She says this is it. We either expose him now, or we let him get away with it. They know there's no turning back now. Their eyes are fixed on the house in front of them, watching every movement, every shadow that passes behind the windows. They've been following this officer long enough to know his routine, the way he works, the people he meets in the dark corners of the city. Hayes feels his heart race as they wait, the silence of the night pressing in on them. They gathered enough evidence. Now they just need to find the last piece of the puzzle and bring it all together. Then they'll move quickly, quietly, and strike before the officer has a chance to cover his tracks. Lopez reaches into the backseat and pulls out a folder containing the final documents they need, a series of phone records that tie the officer directly to an illegal arms deal they've been tracking for weeks. Hayes looks at the documents with satisfaction. This is the proof they need. They won't have to wait any longer. They've got and they know what they have to do next. They drive away from the officer's house knowing that everything they've worked for is about to come to a head. The final chapter in their mission is almost written, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure that justice is served. The battle for the truth is far from over, but Hayes and Lopez are prepared for whatever comes next. The tension is unbearable as Hayes and Lopez prepare for the final confrontation. They've tracked every lead, uncovered every secret, and now everything hinges on this one moment. They know that once they act, there's no going back. The officer they're targeting is just the beginning. They've seen the patterns and the connections. It's a web of corruption that runs deeper than either of them ever imagined. They drive through the night, their destination clear. The time for waiting is over. The officer is vulnerable now. The evidence is irrefutable, and the plan is set. But even as Hayes grips the steering wheel, his thoughts race with doubts. This isn't just about taking down one corrupt officer anymore. It's about dismantling a system built on lies. He glances at Lopez, who is staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Her determination is palpable. They've come so far, and now they're about to burn the bridges that had supported the very system they've sworn to protect. They can't turn back now. Lopez speaks without turning to him. We've got this, Hayes. It's time to end it. We've exposed enough. It's all coming down tonight. Hayes nods silently, the weight of the moment settling in like a heavy cloak. They pull out outside a warehouse, the final location where everything will unfold. The officer they've been tracking has a meeting here tonight with other members of his illegal operation. They know the timing is critical, and the element of surprise is their greatest ally. Hayes and Lopez get out of the car, moving quietly towards the entrance of the warehouse. They've done their homework. They know the layout, and they've made sure that backup is waiting just in case they slip up. The plan is simple: get and gather the evidence and take down the officer before anyone can stop them. But as they approach the door, Hayes can feel something is off. A shiver runs down his spine. This doesn't feel right. They're not just going after one officer anymore. They're taking on a much bigger enemy. Lopez stops and looks at him, her eyes narrowing. You feel it too, don't you? She asks quietly. Hayes nods. His instincts are screaming at him something's wrong, but he can't put his finger on it. They push forward anyway. The door is unlocked, and they slip inside. The warehouse is dark and quiet. The only sound is the echo of their footsteps. They creep through the shadows, moving closer to the meeting room where the officer is supposed to be waiting. They round the corner, and suddenly everything changes. They're surrounded. 4 armed men appear from the darkness, their guns trained on Hayes and Lopez. In an instant, Hayes' heart races as the men step forward. You really thought you could take us down one by one, don't you? One of the men says, his voice dripping with mockery. But you've made a big mistake. You're in over your heads. Hayes feels his pulse quicken, but he stands his ground, his mind racing for a way out. They've been set up. The corruption is much larger than they realized. They're not just dealing with a few bad apples. They stumbled into a network far more dangerous than they ever expected. But they won't back down now. They've come too far. The truth will come out no matter what it takes. Hayes and Lopez exchange a brief look, and in that instant they know they have no choice but to fight to the end.